They broke Chuck Norris's wife's arm, thinking she was alone. 5 minutes later, he was on the doorstep. Subscribe and comment where you're watching from. The morning air in the Texas countryside still held the faint chill of dawn, lingering in the shadows that clung stubbornly to the porch columns of the Norris homestead. Dew sparkled on the grass like frost under a rising sun, and the only sounds were the occasional bird call and the rhythmic breath of wind slipping through the trees. Inside the house, nestled among cedar groves and dusty gravel roads, Gina O'Kelly moved through the kitchen with habitual ease, the quiet confidence of a woman used to solitude but never truly alone. Her husband, Chuck Norris, had left early for a veterans event a few counties over. It was a regular gathering, a ritual of memory and respect he never missed. Gina had kissed him on the cheek, teased him about not punching any bureaucrats during the flag ceremony, and watched from the porch as his truck disappeared in a trail of gravel and sun haze. She didn't worry. She never did. Not about Chuck. The man was a fortress in denim and boots. She poured herself a second cup of coffee and wandered outside to the porch swing, the familiar creak of the chains comforting as she eased into the cushion. Rex, their German shepherd, lay nearby with his head on his paws, eyes alert but relaxed. It was a peaceful morning, almost too quiet, the kind that hummed with the illusion of permanence. She had just begun reading a letter from her sister when Rex's ears twitched. Then, without warning, he stood up, a low growl rolling from his throat. Gina lowered the letter slowly and followed his gaze toward the end of the long driveway. A car was approaching, moving faster than anyone ever should on gravel. Dust bloomed behind it, obscuring its shape until it pulled into view. It was a faded blue Crown Victoria, the kind of vehicle long retired from police fleets. No official markings, no plates. Just a dented body and a crooked antenna trembling with each bump in the road. A single yellow light flickered on its roof, flicking like a weak imitation of authority. Gina stood slowly, heart already beginning to beat a fraction faster. She placed a hand on Rex's collar, holding him back. 3 men emerged from the car. They wore dark uniforms, but none matched. One had a badge sewn crookedly onto his chest. Another wore mirrored sunglasses and a belt too big for his waist. The third, tall and lean, had a crudely taped baton in one hand. No name tags, no agency patches, no insignias. Just the vague, unsettling mimicry of law enforcement. Gina stepped forward, calm but wary. "Can I help you?" she asked, keeping her voice even. "You're Gina O'Kelly?" the tall one asked, scanning a clipboard with feigned authority. "Yes. Who are you?" "We're with the HOA Enforcement Division, responding to multiple violations." He tapped the baton against his leg. "Noise complaints, unauthorized structures, security concerns." Gina's brow furrowed. "This is private land. We're not under an HOA, and you're not law enforcement." The man took a step closer, his smile tight and wrong. "You're obstructing a compliance inspection. That's a finable offense." Behind him, one of the others moved toward the porch, eyes sweeping the surroundings like a predator marking territory. Rex snarled, and the man instinctively reached for his belt, where a gun should have been, but wasn't. Gina tightened her grip on the dog. "You need to leave." The tall man didn't flinch. Instead, he closed the distance between them in 3 long strides and reached out, not fast, but with confidence, as though he were used to getting what he wanted. He grabbed for her phone, which she had instinctively raised. She twisted away, but he was stronger, and with one brutal motion he tore it from her hand and flung it into the yard. She gasped and stepped back. "Get inside," he barked. "Now!" Rex lunged, but Gina held him firm, her knuckles white around his collar. The man with the baton wasn't done. He moved quickly, too quickly. He grabbed Gina's wrist, twisted, and shoved her down onto the porch. A sickening crack split the air as her arm bent the wrong way, her body collapsing with a cry that was equal parts pain and disbelief. The world spun. The breath was knocked from her lungs. She tried to curl around her injury, but the man yanked her up again, this time snapping a zip tie around her uninjured wrist, then the broken one. Her scream was muffled into the wooden planks of the porch. One of the others pushed past her and entered the house. Doors slammed open, cabinets banged, drawers hit the floor. The sound of destruction carried through the walls. She couldn't move. The pain radiated up her arm in waves, and her vision blurred. Still, she tried to speak. You can't do this," she managed. "Shut up," the tall man snapped, grabbing her by the shoulder and shoving her into a seated position against the porch railing. "You brought this on yourself." She heard them laugh, actual laughter, as they kicked through the home Chuck had built with his own hands. The photo frames were tossed aside, boots stomped over rugs and gifts from friends. Somewhere, a vase shattered. Rex barked again, straining against the leash in her hand. He hadn't stopped growling since they arrived. Every hair on his back was raised, his body trembling with a barely contained violence. She thought of Chuck, thought of how he'd know something was wrong. And then she remembered the panic button inside the frame of the porch light. A redundant system Chuck had installed years ago, just in case, that sent a silent alert to his phone if pressed. She looked toward it. The man followed her gaze. "What's that?" he asked, stepping closer. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The pain had her breathless. Her hand twitched toward the beam. He moved to grab her again, but Rex exploded. With a sound that split the air like thunder, the shepherd lunged, dragging Gina forward with him. She screamed, not from fear, but from agony, as her shoulder twisted with the movement. The man backed off, swearing, and raised the baton. "Put that mutt down," he yelled to one of the others. But in the chaos, she managed it. Her free fingers found the trigger under the wooden edge and pressed. 3 times. Click, click, click. 30 miles away, Chuck's phone vibrated. He didn't hear the ringtone. He felt it. Even before the screen lit up, before the name Gina Home Security Emergency flashed in bold red letters, he was already turning the wheel, already reversing down the dirt road in a cloud of dust and gravel. His fingers clenched around the steering wheel like a vice. He didn't curse, he didn't scream, but inside his chest, something ancient, something terrible, stirred. The men in that house had made a mistake. They hadn't just attacked someone, they had attacked his someone. Back on the porch, Gina fought to stay conscious. The sun bore down hard now, the heat stifling. Her arm throbbed, her wrists bled from the zip ties. Her hair clung to her face with sweat. She felt the house rumble behind her as furniture overturned and doors slammed open and shut. She heard the soft beep of the safe. Someone had found it. They were looking for something. Or pretending to. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that Chuck knew. And when he came home, they would understand what it meant to cross that line. They would understand what real justice felt like. And they would remember, too late, that no one puts their hands on the wife of Chuck Norris. Not, and walks away. The tires screamed against gravel as Chuck Norris's truck fishtailed around the last bend. The dust kicked high behind him in a smoky wall that swallowed the road. His jaw was tight, locked in silence. No thoughts, no panic. Just the steady, humming precision of a man who had crossed into that rare and dangerous state of total control. His eyes were fixed forward, The sun glinting off the windshield, blinding in places, but his hands were steady on the wheel. There was no hesitation. There was only destination. The alert had come through just before sunrise ended. A security trip signal, silent and absolute, broadcast from the house's hidden trigger, one he had hardwired himself after refusing to trust the third-party systems. He had walked Gina through how to use it only once. That was all she'd needed. If that signal had been activated, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't curiosity. It meant one thing. Someone had crossed the line. And now they were about to learn what kind of mistake that was. Inside the cab, the world narrowed. The hum of the engine became background noise to the images forming in Chuck's mind. Images he didn't want, but couldn't stop. Gina's face contorted in pain, her voice cut off by force. Shadows of men moving through his home, their hands on the walls, their boots on the rugs she'd picked out herself from Santa Fe. Everything they touched was a violation. He shifted gears and pushed the accelerator harder. The truck responded with a guttural growl and leapt forward, eating up the distance. His other hand drifted briefly to the glove compartment, brushing over the black polymer grip of his Glock 17, as familiar to him as his own breath. He didn't need to look. He knew its weight, its balance. It wasn't anger that filled him. It was memory. Years of training, years of discipline. He wasn't going in wild. He was going in precise. He reached the turnoff for the private drive and killed the headlights. The sun was high enough now that the road shimmered ahead in heat waves, but he didn't want to give them any warning. If they were still there, and they were still there, he needed every edge. The old oak trees along the border of the property threw long shadows across the gravel. He cut the engine halfway up the path, stepped out silently, and closed the truck door with barely a click. The air smelled wrong. Too much oil, rubber, sweat, the faint metallic tang of tension. Even the birds had gone quiet. He moved quickly, but with calculated quiet, using the tree line as cover. The house came into view in pieces. The garage, the porch swing, the open door hanging crookedly on one hinge. A shattered vase glistened in the sunlight like broken ice. Rex's bark echoed once, short, sharp, urgent. He was still alive. That meant Gina was too. Chuck's pace slowed as he approached the porch. Every step deliberate, heel to toe. There were footprints in the dust, boot tracks he didn't recognize, scuff marks. A trail that led from the porch to the gravel, then doubled back inside. He stopped just before the steps. Gina was there, crushed against the porch railing, her arm bent unnaturally, skin pale with pain, sweat tracing down her temple. Her lips were cracked from the heat, her eyes swollen, but she was conscious, and her eyes locked on his with immediate recognition. She didn't cry out, didn't gasp. Her face shifted in one twitch of relief and fury, and her mouth moved without sound. Behind her, the house thudded with movement. He glanced down. Zip ties. Her hands still bound. Her wrist grotesquely swollen and purple. The skin on her face bore the outline of a slap. His vision sharpened into absolute stillness. He was no longer entering a situation. He was the situation. One of the men stepped into the open doorway, chewing a protein bar like he was on break. He didn't even notice Chuck at first. Then he turned, squinted, and froze. The bar dropped from his hand. Chuck didn't speak. His body moved before words could catch up. He launched up the steps, closed the space between them in 2 strides, and slammed the man's wrist into the door frame with bone-cracking force. The baton clattered to the ground. Before the man could shout, Chuck's fist drove into his solar plexus, folding him like a paper bag. He collapsed without a word. The second one, hearing the impact, rushed from the kitchen, raising what looked like a pistol. Fake badge glinting, he aimed and shouted something nonsensical about trespassing. Chuck didn't give him the dignity of a response. He sidestepped the aim, grabbed the man's arm with both hands, and twisted downward, dragging the firearm into the floorboards. A knee to the chest followed, then an elbow to the side of the head. The man slumped against the doorframe, unconscious before he hit the ground. The third man, hearing the commotion, bolted from the back door and made for the car. Rex spotted him first and let out a snarl that echoed like thunder through the trees. The dog lunged past Chuck, leaping from the porch in a blur of muscle and fury, and brought the man down by the thigh. The man screamed, his body flipping sideways as Rex clamped down, holding him there, not tearing, just restraining. Chuck moved to Gina. Her breath was shallow, her face tight with pain, but she whispered, "You came?" He knelt, pulling a knife from his boot and cutting the zip ties carefully. Blood rushed back into her hands, making her wince. He wrapped her wrist in his shirt, tying it tight with the practiced movements of someone who'd done it before under fire. "I got you," he said simply. Rex let out another bark, then whined, alerting Chuck that the man had stopped struggling. Chuck looked at his wife, then back at the house. Everything was broken. Frames shattered, cushions slashed, drawers upended. Their private life, their history, violated. But they were alive. He helped her to her feet, slow and careful, and led her inside. The weight of what had just happened hadn't hit her yet. The pain dominated, the fear lingered beneath. But he knew the aftermath was coming. He needed to be ready. He called it in. Not to 911. Not yet. He had contacts, old friends, people who would take the call seriously, real officers, honest ones. Then he sat beside her on the couch, holding her uninjured hand as she leaned against him, her breathing uneven but steadying. "You didn't kill them," she whispered after a long time. "No." "Why not?" He stared at the broken glass on the floor, at the dusty sunbeam cutting through it all. "Because if I had," he said, "we'd be fighting a different war." She nodded and squeezed his hand. They didn't speak again for a while. The only sound was Rex breathing heavily on the floor, his body finally relaxing, though his eyes never left the front door. Outside, a car approached. Not the battered Crown Victoria. Not an unmarked truck. Real flashing lights. Backup. Chuck stood slowly, helping Gina lie back. He moved toward the door and watched the patrol car roll to a stop. A uniformed officer stepped out, hand on his belt, surveying the scene. "Sir, we received reports of disturbance. Are you the homeowner?" Chuck's voice was calm but carried weight. "Yes. I'm also the husband of the woman they just tried to destroy." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Who's they?" Chuck stepped aside and pointed to the porch, where two of the imposters lay groaning, cuffed with their own zip ties. The third, hand bandaged by his own torn sleeve, sat against the wheel of the car, eyes wide and empty. "That's them." The officer didn't ask more. Not yet. He radioed for additional units, but Chuck already knew. This wasn't just a home invasion. This was the start of something bigger. And he wasn't going to rest until it ended. For good. The sirens didn't scream in frantic pitches anymore. They had faded into the background, replaced by the mechanical clatter of radios, the heavy steps of uniformed officers walking across gravel, and the muted murmur of official protocol. Blue and red lights flickered across the wooden exterior of the Norris home, reflecting against broken glass, the splintered porch railing, and the discarded imitation weapons still lying in the dirt. Chuck stood at the edge of the porch, arms crossed, watching as the first responding officer radioed for EMS and backup, his expression shifting between disbelief and barely contained outrage. Inside the house, Gina lay on the couch, her arm supported by rolled towels and bound with a makeshift brace that Chuck had secured minutes earlier. Her skin was clammy, her breathing shallow but even. Despite the swelling and clear pain etched into her features, her eyes remained sharp and alert. She was watching the front door, not from fear, but resolve. Rex lay at her feet, head resting between his paws, growling low every time one of the imposters stirred. 2 of the 3 fake officers were now under guard outside, their wrists bound with proper restraints, their faces bloodied from the fight they hadn't expected to lose. The 3rd sat against the patrol car, mumbling incoherently about HOA protocol, spitting fragments of jargon he barely understood. It was pitiful to watch. The illusion of power had shattered in minutes. Chuck had barely moved since the officers arrived. His hands remained loose at his sides, but every muscle in his body was coiled. The responding sergeant, a tall man in his 50s with a gray mustache and wary eyes, stepped forward. He held a notepad, but his posture was more about respect than interrogation. "Mr. Norris," he said quietly, nodding once. "We've confirmed your identity. Your wife's too. We're working to identify the suspects." Chuck didn't nod. He didn't blink. "You'll find they're not affiliated with any law enforcement body. Not locally, not federally. They're actors in a uniform they made themselves." The sergeant cleared his throat. "One of my guys found a printed badge in the back of their car. Laminated, misspelled half the words." "Sounds about right," Chuck said, his voice flat. "We're pulling prints now. One of them might have priors in New Mexico. Another one's face flagged on a database for a property scam in Oklahoma." The officer hesitated. "I need your account of what happened." Chuck's eyes flicked toward the doorway where Gina lay. "Not while she's here. She's been through enough." "We can do it outside," the sergeant offered. Chuck stepped down from the porch and followed him a few feet away, out of Gina's earshot. The morning sun was high now, baking the earth beneath their boots. The heat rose in waves from the gravel, curling upward into the stillness. He recounted everything. The call, the silent alarm, what he saw when he arrived, the position of the men, their behavior, the state of his wife, the injuries, the confrontation. His voice didn't rise. He didn't dramatize. But the truth of it landed harder than any theatrical retelling ever could. The officer scribbled notes, asked for clarification once or twice, then stopped writing entirely and just listened. By the time Chuck finished, 2 more cruisers had arrived. Paramedics were now tending to Gina inside, confirming the fracture in her wrist and shoulder. She refused the stretcher, said she wasn't leaving her house until she knew it was secure. Chuck respected that. So did the sergeant. The 3 imposters were loaded into separate units. Each was cuffed, Mirandized, and read their charges aloud: assault, impersonating an officer, criminal trespassing, battery, and, for the one who twisted Gina's arm until it broke, aggravated assault with intent to cause bodily harm. They didn't protest. Not anymore. The bravado had drained from their faces like blood from an open wound. As the last of them was shoved into the back of a cruiser, Chuck stepped forward. He didn't speak to the officers. He spoke to the man directly. The tall one, the one who had issued the fake citations, who had barked lies as though they were gospel. "You didn't make a mistake," Chuck said, his voice quiet but cutting. "You made a decision. You thought the uniform gave you power. You thought my wife was alone." The man didn't look at him. His head hung low. She wasn't. Chuck turned away before the car door slammed shut. By late afternoon, most of the official presence had cleared. A single patrol car remained posted at the end of the driveway. The scene had been photographed, statements taken, and evidence bagged. Broken pieces of Gina's phone, the shattered camera from the porch, even the dog's bloody teeth marks on one of the fake officer's pant legs, every detail now part of an expanding case file. Chuck sat beside Gina, who had been rebandaged and given something for the pain. She was more alert now, less pale. Her eyes were fixed on the news report playing silently on the television. The headline read, "Wife of Chuck Norris attacked by armed imposters posing as law enforcement." The story was already national. Chuck muted the TV and faced her. "They're not coming back," he said. "I know. They'll be prosecuted." She gave a small nod. "And when the trial comes, I'll be there, every day." She looked at him then, and for the first time since the morning began, she smiled. It wasn't wide or easy, but it was real. "They picked the wrong porch," she whispered. Outside, the wind had picked up. It rattled the leaves in the trees, sent small clouds of dust skittering across the drive. The house, though bruised and battered, still stood strong. The walls held their warmth. The doors, though unhinged, would be repaired, but something fundamental had changed. Chuck could feel it in the stillness. This hadn't been a random act. It had been targeted, organized. These men weren't drunk drifters or petty thieves. They had names, records, histories, motives, and someone had sent them. That was what Chuck couldn't shake. That was what would keep him awake long after Gina fell asleep beside him. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was the beginning. He stood once more, walked to the back of the house, where the sunlight had begun to stretch long across the grass. He pulled out his phone, not the modern smartphone he carried, but an old encrypted device he kept in a lockbox. One number lived on that phone, a contact he hadn't called in years. He pressed the button and held it to his ear. After 2 rings, a gravelly voice answered. "Who is this?" Chuck's voice was low, steady. "It's me. I need information. 3 men, fake uniforms, came after my wife." Silence. Then the voice answered, colder than before. "Give me 48 hours." Chuck hung up. He looked at the horizon. The sky had begun to deepen into amber and gray. He wasn't just going to wait for justice. He was going to finish what had started on that porch. And whoever had sent those men would learn, one way or another, that Chuck Norris didn't wait for the law to catch up. He was the line, and they had already crossed it. The morning after the confrontation brought with it a heavy stillness. The house smelled of antiseptic and fresh plaster, and the early sunlight filtered through the living room blinds in thin, clean slats that cut across the furniture like measured lines. The chaos of the day before had been pushed back into order as best it could. Broken glass swept away, splintered chairs replaced, the front door now replaced by a temporary steel frame Chuck had installed himself before midnight. The only thing he hadn't touched was a spot on the porch where Gina had fallen. That he had left untouched, raw and silent, like a scar still healing. Some marks weren't meant to be scrubbed clean, they were meant to be remembered. Gina sat on the couch with her arm in a fresh sling, her hair pulled back and her expression unreadable as she watched the muted news broadcast on the screen. Her face was no longer pale, but taut with something firmer than pain. Chuck watched her from the kitchen, a mug of coffee in his hand. She hadn't said much since the night before. The fight had left her body, but not her mind. He understood. He felt the same. The story had gone national. Every major outlet had picked it up by morning. Attack on the Norris family. Chuck Norris confronts armed imposters. Texas couple targeted by fake officers. Headlines bloated with urgency, speculation, and half-formed truths. The footage from the neighbor's porch cam had been leaked, grainy but damning. The moment one of the imposters twisted Gina's arm played on a loop in the corner of every feed, alongside stills of Chuck standing over the restrained suspects, face grim, fists clenched. But the most significant coverage didn't come from television. It came from the courtroom. 2 days after the incident, all 3 assailants were brought before a federal judge in a hearing that was meant to be procedural but rapidly turned into a media spectacle. Chuck and Gina arrived quietly, ushered through the back to avoid the flood of cameras. Gina wore a loose sweater over her sling and sunglasses to shield her from the flashbulbs. Chuck walked beside her, his presence enough to clear a path. The courtroom smelled of wood polish and formality. It was colder than expected. Chuck had always thought justice should feel warm, human. Instead, it felt sterile, mechanical. The judge presiding was a woman with hard eyes and a clipped voice, someone who didn't frown or smirk, only weighed. On the opposite end, the 3 defendants sat in orange jumpsuits, their hands cuffed in front of them, their expressions drained of arrogance. The defense attorney, a wiry man in a cheap suit, did his best to create distance between his clients and the truth. He spoke of confusion, misunderstanding, blurred lines of authority. He tried to paint the 3 men as misguided patriots, citizens attempting to uphold property laws in a community plagued by lax enforcement. He referred to them repeatedly as volunteers, as if wearing fake uniforms, wielding illegal weapons, and breaking a woman's arm could somehow be dismissed as civic enthusiasm. Chuck listened in silence, his jaw tightening with each word. He could feel Gina next to him, her fingers curling tighter in her lap. The attorney spoke of community responsibility, of miscommunication, of boundaries and gray areas. But then came the evidence. The prosecution didn't argue. They didn't grandstand. They presented, cleanly, efficiently. They showed the video. They brought in the emergency room doctor who treated Gina. He described the fracture, the muscle tearing, the impact on her pregnancy. They introduced the laminated badges found in the suspect's car, complete with misspellings and fake department seals. They showed text messages exchanged between the defendants, messages that joked about making an example of someone. They showed maps of Chuck's property annotated with plans. They read out loud a list of previous incidents involving one of the suspects in another county where a disabled veteran had been harassed under the guise of fake HOA compliance. Piece by piece, the story was no longer a narrative. It became fact. Cold, indisputable fact. When the prosecutor finished, there was no applause, no gasps, just the heavy hush of consequence. The judge's voice cut through the stillness. The defendants are found guilty on all charges: aggravated assault, impersonation of law enforcement, trespassing, conspiracy to commit fraud. Sentencing will be determined pending further investigation into associated parties and financial sponsors. Gina exhaled sharply beside Chuck. Not relief, something deeper, something more like release. Chuck didn't move, didn't celebrate. He stared across the courtroom at the 3 men who had invaded his home, and he saw not opponents, not even enemies, but cowards, men who had cloaked themselves in pretend power because they had none of their own. And now, stripped of everything, they had to face the one thing they never expected: the truth. But Chuck wasn't done. That evening, after the courtroom had cleared and the news vans had moved on, he sat on the back porch with his phone in hand. The number from the old secure device was still fresh in his mind. He dialed again. The man who answered was terse. "I've got what you need," the voice said. Chuck listened in silence. "They were hired, not acting alone. There's a developer, name's not public, but he's been buying out land up and down your county, offering residents buyouts. When they don't sell, things happen. Doors get kicked in, laws get enforced. Looks like you were next on the list." Chuck closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "Names," he said. "I'll send you what I have. But be careful. These people have reach. They hide behind laws, LLCs, and shell companies. They use threat the way you use your fists. Precise, targeted." Chuck didn't respond. He didn't have to. He already knew what he was going to do. That night, he sat with Gina and told her everything. She listened, her face expressionless at first, then quietly furious. They talked for hours. Not about revenge, not about violence, but about exposure, proof. He wasn't going to storm anyone's office or take justice into his own hands. That would be too easy, too short-lived. He wanted the system to see itself, and then dismantle itself. Together, they drafted a public statement. It was personal but direct. It spoke of the right to safety, the danger of unchecked authority, the rise of private enforcers with no accountability. It named names, carefully, legally, but pointedly. They released it through a network of allies, veterans groups, law enforcement forums, legal advocates. It spread like fire. Within days, state lawmakers announced a proposal for new legislation, the O'Kelly Act, a bill designed to prevent private organizations from employing pseudo-law enforcement tactics without state verification, licensing, and oversight. It required transparency, clear identification, a hotline to report impersonation. It was just a beginning. But it was real. The developer's name surfaced in investigative reports soon after. More stories emerged. A family in West Texas who'd been driven out by threats. A widow in Oklahoma whose property had been reclaimed by men in matching vests. A dozen small stories forming one massive picture. Chuck watched it unfold, not with satisfaction, but with quiet purpose. Justice didn't always wear a badge or carry a gavel. Sometimes it came slowly, wrapped in documents and hearings and debates. But when it moved with weight. A week after the verdict, Chuck returned to the porch where it all began. The scarred wood still bore faint scratches. Rex lay beside him, head on his paws, eyes alert but calm. Gina stepped out, her arm healing, her presence as solid as ever. She sat beside him, their shoulders touching. "They'll think twice next time," she said softly. "They won't get a next time," he replied. The sun dipped low over the hills, casting everything in gold. Chuck leaned back and looked out over the land he had built, the home he had defended, and the woman he had fought for. He had always believed that strength wasn't in the strike, but in knowing when not to strike. That power wasn't in violence, but in restraint. That justice didn't need vengeance. It needed clarity. And now clarity had arrived. The lie had fallen, and truth stood in its place. Winter came late to Texas that year, not the harsh, unforgiving cold of the northern plains, but a slower, gentler turning of the season. The trees shed their leaves in quiet confession, the grass dulled under a pale sky, and the air took on that crisp edge that reminded you to breathe a little deeper. The Norris house, once marked by sirens and shattered peace, now stood with a new kind of stillness. Not silence born from shock, but the kind that followed resolution. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth crackled softly, casting golden light on the wooden beams and the warm rug beneath the coffee table. Rex dozed near the hearth, his body coiled in comfort, his breathing even. Chuck sat by the window in an old armchair with a leather spine and cracked edges, the kind of chair that remembered decades. In his hand, he held a folded letter, the final draft of the O'Kelly Act signed into law just 2 days ago by the state governor. He didn't smile, not really, but something in his chest eased, a pressure released, like a taut rope finally unknotted. Gina entered the room slowly, her arm out of the sling now, the bruising faded into soft yellow and green. She wore a dark sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. Her strength had never left her, not during the pain, not through the trial, and not even during the long nights when sleep refused to come and the shadows felt too loud. She sat on the arm of the chair beside Chuck, one hand resting gently on his shoulder. "They passed it," she said softly, though she knew he already knew. He nodded. "I read the whole thing. And they got it right." The O'Kelly Act would forever change how private security firms, homeowners associations, and local pseudo-authorities operated. No more fake uniforms, no more unsanctioned patrols, no more harassment under the guise of enforcement. Real identification, real registration, real accountability. It wasn't sweeping federal reform, not yet, but it was the kind of victory that cracked open larger doors. It was the kind of precedent others could follow. Chuck placed the letter gently on the side table and took Gina's hand. "You did this," she said. "No," he corrected. "We did." The trial had ended 3 weeks prior. The 3 imposters had been sentenced to a combined total of 32 years in prison. The court didn't buy their lawyers' desperate pivot to mental instability or community protection. The evidence had been too strong, their intent too clear. But more than that, the judge, whose voice had been sharp and unwavering throughout, had made a final statement during sentencing that neither Chuck nor Gina would forget. This court recognizes the difference between law and theater, between authority and illusion, and today it draws a hard line. You impersonated the law. You used fear as a weapon. You assaulted the innocent, and you did so with pride. That ends here. It hadn't been about vengeance, not for Chuck, not even after he'd seen Gina on the ground with her arm twisted and her face streaked with silent tears. Not even when he'd held his finger over the trigger and felt every instinct telling him to end it all with one clean shot. He hadn't wanted blood. He had wanted truth. And now, truth had done its job. The news cycle had moved on. Another scandal, another outrage. But in the Norris household, the echoes of that day remained not as scars, but as lessons carved into the very wood of the porch, the doorway, the frame of the bedroom where Gina now slept peacefully through the night. They didn't plan to leave. The house was theirs. The land was theirs. And the line that had been crossed once would never be crossed again. Later that week, they attended a town hall event where Chuck had been invited to speak. It wasn't a press event. There were no cameras, just community members, neighbors, and law enforcement officials. The room was warm with the smell of coffee and old wood. Chuck stood behind the lectern in a flannel shirt and jeans, no fanfare, no entourage. Just a man speaking plainly. He didn't tell the story again. Everyone there already knew it. Instead, he spoke about boundaries, about responsibility, about what happens when people mistake intimidation for protection. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. But when he spoke the words, "If someone walks onto your porch in a uniform with no name, no badge, and no soul, you have every right to ask who sent them," The room fell into a silence that hummed with understanding. Afterward, people lined up to shake his hand. Some thanked him, some simply nodded. A few told their own stories, less violent, perhaps, but still bound by the same thread. Ordinary people bullied by those pretending to wear power. When they returned home that night, Gina curled up beside him on the porch swing, a blanket over both of them, Rex at their feet. The stars had come out in full force, clean and cold and ancient. The wind rustled the trees with a whisper that sounded like permission to rest. "You think they'll come back?" she asked, not out of fear, but curiosity. "No," he said. "They've learned." "But what if someone else tries?" Chuck looked out into the darkness, his gaze steady. "Then I'll be here," he said, "and so will the law, the real one this time." She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. It wasn't the end of danger, that much he knew. The world didn't run out of predators, but it was the end of pretending, the end of shadows and borrowed uniforms walking freely through other people's lives. And that was enough for now. A week later, they received a letter in the mail. Not from the government, not from any agency. It was handwritten on simple paper. The return address was from a small town in Arizona. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Norris, I watched what happened to you and your wife, and I want you to know that because of your story, our town council is passing its own ordinance. We're no longer allowing private security to operate without full state registration. My daughter was harassed by someone last year pretending to be HOA. At the time, we didn't think we could fight it, but now we do. You stood up, so now we're standing too. Thank you. Sincerely, Catherine Reed." Chuck folded the letter and placed it on the mantel. He didn't say anything to Gina. He didn't have to. The world had changed. Not all at once, not loudly, but one line at a time. And in the quiet of their home, in the strength of their unity, in the calm after the fire, they had drawn the most important line of all. The one that would not be crossed again. Because someone had finally said enough and meant it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and other powerful stories on the channel, and don't forget to share this one with someone who needs to see it.